Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. I'm your host, Kevin J. N. Hughes, and I am once again joined by my good friend Sarkis. And, you guys have probably noticed, even a little bit, that Sarkis and I have some differences in our theology, but it doesn't really matter because the things that we have that are slight variations aren't a big deal, and we have a lot more in common than we differ. And here's the truth, no two people are going to be exactly the same. And being Orthodox isn't about being a cookie cutter, um, in your cookie cutter theology that you just parrot some argument from some church father. Being Orthodox is about a life that we live as Orthodox Christians. And so sometimes we don't present things in exactly the same way, and we might have different perspectives on things, and that's totally okay. But what I love about this is that it also has given us an opportunity to show how much, even though Sarkis and I are coming from slightly different traditions, his church and mine have not been in communion for just a few hundred years, right, Sarkis?
Just
Uh,
yeah, yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah.
Um,
It happened during my great grandpa's time, though.
right, exactly. Um, and, but at the same time, some of the things we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be covering issues not only regarding a religion that we both believe is a totally false religion because it's completely outside of Christianity, but we're also going to be covering some things that we disagree with some people who do call themselves Christian, and we're going to be talking about that as well. And
Mm.
so I bring up the fact that there are sometimes some differences so that I can just highlight this because I know that this is something that comes up sometimes when I'm talking to Muslims, which, by the way, Islam is not this monolith either, so I don't know why Muslims are always saying this stuff. But also Hindus and Jews and all different groups of people. One of the things that often gets brought up is like, hey, you guys don't all, you guys who all recognize Jesus of Nazareth don't all believe all the same things. So, why should I trust Jesus of Nazareth or whatever the argument may be? And I think it's really important to understand that, yeah, there are going to be some differences, and some of that is because there are heresies, like some of the things we're going to be talking about today. But some of it is also because, each individual person has their own struggles with sin and their own things that they're working through with God, and we have to be respectful of where different people are and not, as St. Paul says, we don't judge another person, we let them stand or fall before their master, and we walk together as one because ultimately, if we're under the Holy Church of Christ, then even though we might disagree on some things, even though there might be some issues or whatever, ultimately, when we're under the true Church of Christ, we're walking together and we might be in different places on that path, but we are on the same path. And people who are outside of that may not be on that path. And so the goal for them is to get them on the path, whereas the goal for each other is to lift each other up and keep walking along the path. And so, without further ado, Sarkis, I don't want to monopolize all your time talking about that. I just wanted to get it out of the way right away because we
Right.
are going to be talking about some stuff that might be seen as, sectarian issues, both within, based on the article you sent me, it sounds like there are some sectarian issues within Hinduism that we're going to cover. So I want to give Hindus that same charity that, we're not presenting your religion as if it's some kind of simplistic monolith. We want to
Right.
cover We want to cover the complexities within Hinduism as well. And then also, I want to give that so that people understand that not all of Christianity is just this monolithic thing. There are things that we have to cover from, problems within our own camp too. So we take the mote out of our own eye and or the beam out of our own eye and then help our neighbor with the mote in his eye as well. But like I said, I don't want to monopolize your time. You came here to discuss um, a couple things. One thing that you wanted to talk about that I think really sets the stage for a really good discussion is you had talked about one of the things that Hindus often bring up is the wrath of God in Scripture. And
Right.
so I want to, first off, I want to understand what is kind of the Hindu objection here, and then how do you answer it from an Orthodox perspective?
Right. So the objection that I often get is, it's similar. It's similar to the same objection we get from atheists or, whatever other group, which is like, oh, the God in the Old Testament seems so angry, so wrathful.
Mm-hmm.
He's like a cosmic like a cosmic tyrant or bully or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Which
and
is I have to say, like, that is an argument I've never fully understood because when
Mhm.
I read the Old Testament, I don't see that at all. Like, I can't
Yeah.
see what these people are saying. When I read the Old Testament, I see a God of long suffering and deep patience as he walks with his people through
Mhm.
horrible trials and sins and all kinds of things and never abandons them. But we can talk more about that a little bit later. I don't want to cut you
Right.
off too much, but I'm just saying that for me, from my perspective, I find it really, when I hear this objection, I find it difficult to
Yeah.
sympathize with. Um, but that aside, go ahead, present the objection and how you answer it.
Okay. I'm gonna try to sort of steel man this the best I can.
Okay.
And this won't be hard for me to steel man because um when I was a Hindu, I had a lot of these same objections.
Right.
So for there's the obvious ones like, okay, why did God kill the firstborns of Egypt? What did they
Right.
do? Like they're babies, they're innocent and all these things. Why did God flood the world? Is it really possible that everybody but Noah's family was that bad or whatever? Like, why does he kill so many people? Why did he, you know, why did he just completely wipe Sodom and Gomorrah off the map? All these things you typically hear, right?
Right.
Um, and for me, at that time, one of the one of the things that sort of got me in a bind about it, that sort of led me to leaving the Christian faith altogether for a while. It's that I felt that there was a lot of hypocrisy on God's part. Like you say, I was thinking like about the God of the Bible. Like he
Hmm.
says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man will his blood be shed, and do not murder, do not do this, do not do that. Like all these good things, right? And
Hmm.
so um so in my mind, I was thinking like, okay, you're talking all this good stuff. Why don't you do it?
Right.
Like, why are you sort of arbitrarily like even though yeah, I get it. You're the one that makes the laws. Why are you sort of arbitrarily breaking those laws while telling us to like diligently keep them or whatever? Um, and it's something that I sort of struggled with for a while. And then, other parts of it were like, oh, did did this group or that group have to die and all that. So what I got what sort of got me to the point of starting to reconsider that frame of thinking was that I realized um, I was looking at things from a very materialistic standpoint
Right.
because like, oh, the baby, the poor, the poor babies, they were, killed in one night. They never got a chance to live, and did it. And it was sort of, it wasn't until later that I realized, like, well, yeah, it is a tragedy if there's nothing after death, right?
Right.
But so I noticed that a lot of these atheist critiques sort of assume that dying is like one of the worst things that could happen to you. Even
Right.
dying violently is like one of the worst things that could happen to you.
Hmm.
Um, because um, it assumes that earthly life is the greatest good.
Right.
And being deprived of earthly life, um, being deprived of earthly life is like the greatest evil or like one of the greatest evils. So I realized that what a lot of these people, including myself, were doing is essentially going at a critique of a non-materialistic system of thought from a materialistic perspective.
Right.
Because if there isn't only this life, right? Then perhaps, perhaps God, you know, does what he does, whether it's, taking the souls of the firstborn or um, the utter decimation of Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe that was their sort of penance.
Hmm.
Okay,
Well,
not the children. That was more a punishment for their parents, but
right.
Sodom, I mean. Um,
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I also think it's a overly simplistic critique for the simple reason that when you actually study these, because a lot of people they say incorrectly that God had the Israelites wipe out the Canaanites, but that's not actually true. In fact, there are some groups that God says you are not to take even an inch of land from these groups because they also are sons of Abraham. And those groups were also Canaanites. And there's other tribes that the Israelites are commanded to basically conquer or displace, but they're not allowed to slaughter them. So it's really only and there's another thing that people often miss about this, which is God explicitly states that he's also given these peoples who are to be wiped out a chance to repent. He says, I have suffered long with them for this much time. So it's not like these people groups were just innocently hanging around, doing their thing, living in peace like the way liberals think Native Americans were just this totally peaceful, war-free society until white people showed up and ruined it.
yeah,
Um,
some of them were okay. Let's not paint with a broad brush. Some of them were, others were not.
yeah, yeah, no, I get what you're saying, but my point is that
Right,
it's
right, right.
like that's not what was going on
In
in the
Canaan.
land of Canaan. There was not this like everybody's just living in harmony and then the Israelites show up and start murdering people. that wasn't happening. It was these
Yeah.
are extremely violent, extremely evil, cannibalistic tribes, and using
I'm imagining like a ironic satirical cartoon of this
right,
where the Canaanites are having like a flowery festival, and then the Israelite army just shows up, and they're like, "Oh, new friends! Hello, new
right.
friends! Oh
Right, exactly.
no!"
So,
Like a satire, but
exactly. So it's like that this is kind of, I realize that I'm kind of making a joke out of it or making light of it to some degree, but my point is that the way this is often presented is in terms that don't really do the Bible justice towards its portrayal. And if I'm fully honest with you, there's still aspects of the story that I do struggle with. I would like, if I'm honest, I would wish that the story was different and that God commanded the Israelites to adopt all of the kids up to a certain age and slaughter everybody else or whatever. But
and who knows? I
yeah,
mean, it's probably wishful thinking on my part, but maybe they did.
yeah, I mean, maybe, but, and then the other aspect too is that you have to remember that in reality, what was the alternative if the Israelites didn't do this? The alternative is that these kids grow up in a bloody society that is cannibalistic and end up participating in the same depraved rituals um that
Did
include
you
cannibalism.
did you
So
know about did you know about the masks?
like the wolf masks and things.
No, not wolf masks. The Canaanite masks.
Oh yeah, yeah. And that like they're just monstrous. And yeah. Yeah, there
They
were
don't
some
they're not
really
particularly monstrous, but they're creepy because they're smiling faces.
right. Yeah,
And
no, they're really disturbing.
and they would, I think, if I remember right, they would either put them on the children or the parents or both. I can't remember which one. So to like hide the agony of what's going on.
Exactly. Yeah,
And then
because they are literally um yeah, they're literally murdering people ritualistically. Let me see. Here's a good example of one what you're talking about. Let me see if I can.
put it
Can I
on the
share my
screen.
screen? Yeah, let me see if I can share my screen here so that you can see what he's talking about. These bizarre masks. I've got some other examples here, but this one's a good example of like, so they would use these to cover the faces of their victims so that they wouldn't have to be faced with the reality of what they were doing. Yeah,
Yeah. And
really.
and I mean at least the Aztecs, okay, I know, you know, it's weird I'm saying at least, but the Aztecs would typically you know, hold you down, plunge a dagger into your chest, pull out your heart, and then you would, you know, after a few moments, you would die. It's
Hmm.
terrible. It's gruesome. Oh yeah, and then they would cut off your head and roll it down the steps of the pyramid so that it left a blood trail.
Right.
Anyway, but as terrible as that is, this was worse than that. The way they typically sacrifice children is that they burn them alive,
Right.
slow,
Exactly.
such that the priests or like the assistants of the priests um, would chant loudly, blow flutes, and bang drums to sort of drown out the screams of the children.
Yeah. So these are the people that God is
Is or
commanding the Israelites
to
to
take out.
take out. It's not like innocent people. It's very grotesque societies. And what's really going on with this is God is, which this isn't a popular concept today either, but God is basically having this ritual and these practices wiped off from the face of the earth. It's actually like a religious crusade more so than a genocidal campaign because, again, the offer of repentance is there. God says, I've suffered long with these people. So the offer of repentance is there. If somebody from that tribe pulls a Rahab and says, I don't want to do these rituals, I want to worship the true God who doesn't demand these awful sacrifices, they're free to do that, and the Israelites will accept them because, contrary to modern belief, the Israelite religion actually was not an ethnic religion. In fact, the concept of ethnicity is an extremely modern concept. So ancient Israelites had no concept of ethnicity. You were a child
Yeah.
of Abraham through ritual participation. So if somebody wanted to convert, all they had to do was do the rituals and become an Israelite. And
Yeah, and
frankly, if an Israelite wanted to become one of these degenerate tribes that were murdering people, they had that right too. They could go there and worship their gods, and a lot of Israelites did choose that, unfortunately.
yeah,
But all of that is to say, so just to kind of give people the background there that it's not the simplistic way that it's often presented, but it's a painful thing to talk about. It's a tragedy that people were doing these evil things. It's a tragedy that apparently the only way to stop it was through violent military action. It's deeply unfortunate, and we don't say this with joy. We say it with a heavy heart that this was necessary, but it is something that I ultimately believe was justified in its time. So
yeah,
whatever
and
that entails.
keyword in its time.
Hmm. Yeah,
This,
because today there's different, one thing is that I do think that if we as a Christian society, like if America converted tomorrow and was a Christian society and we wanted to, you know, we found some tribe that was doing these same things and God revealed to some prophet that we needed to stop this, then I don't think it would be necessary to have the same, kind of military action because now there would be infrastructure that you could, I don't know, go in and educate and do things that weren't really possible to people at that time. So, just a
yeah,
thought, just a thought. I know it's kind of a hypothetical, but I'm just saying
right.
that I
Yeah,
do think,
or short of that, put those people in prison or on the
right.
electric chair and take away their children.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, the death penalty exists for a reason. People who do awful, depraved things have to have consequences, but we don't punish children, because we don't, there's no need to in our society. We have infrastructure that can take care of these things. So anyway, all of that is kind of a side point
Yeah.
to how you actually, some of that may be involved in how you answer this objection, but on a fundamental level, um, what are, and maybe you've already answered this to some degree with what you've already said, but I just want to make sure that I'm not,
Mhm.
um, I want to make sure that I'm not kind of getting in the way of you actually
Right.
stating your answer to if a Hindu objects, like, okay, it really looks like there's a lot of bloodshed in your holy book, and I'm concerned about this. Maybe he even says, I would convert, but I don't really like the violence of the Old Testament. Okay. So maybe some of it is all that we've already said, but is there anything else that you would want to make them aware of in your argument?
Well, and here I'm going to speak to them as a former Hindu.
Okay.
The idea of divine violence or divinely sanctioned violence is not exclusive to us.
Right.
So now we're gonna, there's tons of examples of of both divine wrath and divine manipulation for ultimately good ends in Hindu scripture. Um, so, for example, in the Devi Mahatmya, um, there is a story of Vishnu, who is
Mm-hmm.
the who, depending on which tradition you belong to, is the supreme person of Godhead, the God with a capital G. And there are these there are these two asuras. Uh, some people say demons. Demons isn't really a good um, translation. It's more like lesser deities. But so there are these two asuras, Madhu and Kepava. I think it's Madhu and Kepava. I'd have to go back. It's been a while since I've read the Devi Mahatmya, but essentially they get they have a boon where that's granted to them by one of the gods, where no one can slay them. Um, I'm trying to remember the conditions. Like no one can slay them under any conditions. So like you can't if their feet are on solid ground, you can't kill them. If they're standing on water or in air, um, uh, they can't be killed. Like they're invulnerable. So like in almost every condition, they're invulnerable. So then Vishnu, uh, so then they're like taunting even Vishnu because they say like even Vishnu can't kill us. So what Vishnu does um, is he takes them on his knee so that their feet aren't touching anything, and then he decapitates them. um, Another for divine deception because they'll say like oh when there because there's instances in the Bible where like God punishes people by deliberately deceiving them. Like what was the name of the king who's
Ahab, yeah. God sends
yeah,
a
yeah
lying spirit.
he sends what appears to be a demon to give false messages to his prophets to essentially manipulate him into going into battle and getting killed.
Right.
um yeah in our legends like in Hindu legends, that stuff is not absent either.
Right.
For example, one of the forms or incarnations of Vishnu again is Mohini. I believe it was Mohini. Basically, one of his divine female forms, which which is supposed to be a beautiful, beautiful celestial being.
Hmm.
Um, that then sort of he uses to sort of seduce the evil like Ashuras and the demons and stuff into their own destruction. Like he uses that seductive form to manipulate them into doing things that ultimately lead to their destruction.
Right.
Probably the biggest example of this of God, because they're like, okay, well, why did God sort of tell the Israelites to do his dirty work? Uh, why didn't he just like rain fire on them like he did with Sodom and Gomorrah? Ultimately, we don't know, but for reasons that only he can understand, he did it. Now, if we look at the Hindu stories, probably the most famous example would be the Mahabharata, specifically the events that unfold during the Bhagavad Gita. Um, for those who are not familiar, obviously, my our Hindu listeners are gonna know this, but for those who are not familiar, just to give a brief synopsis, the Mahabharata is one of the great epics of India, one of the great um, national stories, and it tells the story of the the Kuru clan, which is believed to be um, traditionally one of the great ancestral clans of ancient India. Now, within this Kuru clan, there are there sort of emerged two branches, and these branches belong to two of the uh, two of the brothers that are born of this clan. One one group is made up of the sons of Pandu, and the other group is made up of the sons of Dhritarashtra. And the sons of Pandu are raised well. They grow up to be righteous and upright. Um, Not perfect, but overall righteous and upholders of dharma, which I'll get more into that idea later. And the other group are the Kauravas, which are the sons of Dhritarashtra, and they are wicked, jealous, deceitful, and the whole story is them trying to kill the Pandavas, the five brothers, uh, who are the sons of Pandu, and usurp their throne.
Hmm.
Um, and the and they even outnumber them because the Pandavas are five brothers, and the Kauravas are 100 brothers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they outnumber them. And things come to a head. Awesome story, by the way, for those who love reading the stories and mythos of other cultures. Can't recommend that enough. If you like the Iliad and
Absolutely.
the Odyssey, read the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. But long story short, things come to a head, and the Pandavas are forced to fight for their rightful place on the throne. And so there's going to be this battle on the field in this plain called Kurukshetra. And so on the day of the battle, Arjuna, the prince of the story, is is taking his chariot to survey the battlefield. And Krishna, who is the incarnation of Vishnu in this story, in this epic, um, has volunteered to be his charioteer. And he sort of in certain ways he favors the Pandavas because they're righteous, but um, he's also trying to be impartial. So ahead of the battle, he made a deal with both sides where he said, both of you, and he was talking to Arjuna on one end, and Duryodhana, who's the head of the the Kaurava brothers, the bad guys. He basically said, either of you can either choose me as your advisor or choose my armies. Like I will give you my armies because at this point Krishna was had risen up to the status of being a prince of the city of Dvaraka, um, which is like sort of the Indian version of Atlantis in certain ways. It's sunk beneath the waves. Anyway, so basically said one of you can have me as their advisor, and the other can have my armies. Which and either of you could choose either one. Now Duryodhana, vain and short-sighted as he was, is like, oh, I'll take the armies, thanks.
Right.
I'll take the armies. And Krishna and Arjuna looks at Krishna and he says, I only desire you. He So he's the wise one. He says, I'd rather have
Right.
you as my wise advisor. So on the day of the battle, he's surveying the battlefield and he's ready to go. He's hyped. He's gonna, ready to score a victory. But then he looks over the battlefield and he sees his family members, like from the other side of the family, people he grew up, you know, as a child sitting on their laps, people who he would bow and touch their feet, people who he loves and adores, but on the Kauravas side of the battlefield. And he
Right.
and he loses his nerve. Long story short, and this is what starts the whole dialogue of the Bhagavad Gita, which is basically he loses his nerve and he tells Krishna, um, I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't lay a hand against my relatives, even if they are fighting for my deceitful cousins. Uh, uh, even if they kill me and my brothers, I can't kill them. And he says, I'd rather abandon my kingdom, abandon the throne, and just go off and be a monk. Go off and live a life as a recluse.
Right.
And Krishna, for lack of a better word, says, you know, get over it.
Right.
He says, he, um, he basically says like, this is your duty, and people who don't understand why you want to bow out, they'll think you just lost your nerve and you're a coward, and the good name of your family and your household will be ruined, and your deceitful evil cousins will take control of the kingdom, and corruption will set in the land.
Right.
So basically, you have to pick up your bow and go forward with the battle, and for lack of a better word, you know, kill your cousins and family members.
Right.
um, and this is where it sort of veers into philosophical territory, because then they start talking about the nature of the soul, and how even though the body can be killed and cut up and dismembered and all that, the soul can't be hurt.
Right.
So even if he basically, like, one of the things he does to, like, he says to sort of help him shore up his courage is, you're not, ultimately speaking, you're not really killing them.
Right.
Um, so here we have an example of God in Hinduism, of God with the capital G, um, the creator of the creator of the cosmos, the creator of heaven and earth, the timeless, immortal being, telling Krishna, a mere mortal, to go and essentially make sure that justice is done.
Right.
And during the climax of the Bhagavad Gita, he even says, "I have killed them already. It's your choice whether you want to be my instrument of justice."
Right.
So divine wrath is not something that is Abrahamic. Um, in different religious traditions,
Yeah.
uh, the gods will act wrathfully against humans for different reasons. Sometimes capricious, other times justifiable. In the
Right.
in the case of Hinduism, as someone who's been on both sides of the fence, a Hindu and now a Christian, what Krishna says makes complete sense to me even now as a Christian.
Right.
Like, there are wicked, evil people who will do
Exactly.
wicked, evil things, and if the right people don't stop them, then justice is not done. So even though it's hard, sometimes those wicked, evil people and those who have sided with those wicked, evil people need to be punished.
Right.
They need
Any
to.
rational notion of justice has to, at some point, face the reality that justice must be carried out. Um, and there are times where that requires the sword, as Romans 13 says, those who have been given the sword don't wield it in vain. And Hinduism has the same thing within its philosophy, rightly so. Like, this is an area where Hindus and Christians are actually in agreement. Like, this is something where we're on the same page, so to speak, with our Hindu friend.
Yeah. And and I definitely see that overlap because unlike other pagan traditions, uh in the Hindu tradition, he's not, Krishna isn't hasn't decided that these people need to die because um they haven't been giving him sacrifices or because
Right,
they haven't they said something irreverent to piss him off or something. Um he simply sees disorder and injustice in his creation, and he comes to clean it
right,
by whatever means he deems necessary for reasons that only he understands. So, and then it gets even more bloody once you get into the Shaivite tradition, because I would say the Vaishnava tradition is the closest in terms of both aesthetics and imagery and sort of uh, tameness to Christianity. If
hmm,
we were like to pick any Hindu tradition, especially uh, especially the Sri Vaishnava tradition of Ramanuja, the philosopher I've mentioned before. Um, but then there's the Shaiva tradition, which sees Shiva as the supreme person of Godhead, the Mahapurusha. And in that tradition, there's a lot more graphic imagery. My goodness, like everyone, everyone's familiar with the image of Kali, and
right,
they sort of assume like, oh, she must be like their goddess of death or whatever. Not really. She's just seen as the fearsome form of the Godhead.
right,
And those heads, you see her wearing a necklace of skulls, holding like a severed head with blood dripping from it or whatever. All of those are demons that she killed.
right,
So as gruesome as it is, Kali is basically the personification of divine wrath
right.
against adharma. So, because in Hinduism you have uh, again, for those who don't know this, uh, you have the idea of dharma and adharma. So dharma means basically. Let me sort of explain the etymology of it, so then it'll make sense.
Hmm.
So the word dharma comes from the Sanskrit root dhar, which like dhar, which is in its most sort of literal meaning would be the central pole that would hold up a tent or the central pillar that would hold up a house. Like it would be like in the center of the building and sort of hold up the roof.
Right,
So it's that which so dharma is that which upholds, that which supports and is like sort of the foundation, the thing that holds everything else up. So dharma is sort of like the cosmic natural order of things. It's um, the the divine natural law.
right.
Now, um, in Hinduism, they have the concept of avatara, which is the idea that periodically, from time to time, adharma has reached a sort of fever pitch in the cosmos, and the Godhead, whoever you see as the supreme person, the Godhead must then come down in various ways and in various incarnations to then set things right and sort of reset things to a good state. Now, Hinduism has a cyclical cosmology, so ultimately there is no ultimate resolution to adharma. It's just something that sort of fluctuates for all eternity. But as sort of the natural way of things, as part of this sort of cyclical eschatology, when things get to a intolerable point, um, God intervenes to set things right, at least for the time being.
Right.
Um, so,
Is that where the whole destroyer of worlds things comes in?
bingo.
Okay.
Yeah. So the whole destroyer of worlds is again like it's not so much like yeah, I destroy things because it's fun, like because I can.
Right.
It's no, like destruction is seen as part of creation and uh sort of a necessity, because from the Hindu perspective, creation necessitates destruction and destruction necessitates creation.
Right. Because it's all
And
cyclical.
right. And from the perspective of adharma, which is like unrighteousness, injustice, or whatever, yeah, sometimes the agents and fruits of adharma need to be burned with divine fire, and that's what that destroyer of worlds thing is. So the when we take all this into account, from even from a Hindu perspective, if one is a traditional Hindu, now, since Hinduism is not particularly dogmatic, somebody could say, yeah, but all that is a little too harsh for me, so I sort of just take that as metaphorical, and I don't really believe God does that. Yeah, I don't really believe God punishes. If you're one of those, then I don't know. I don't know what to say to you. We're gonna have a separate conversation.
Right.
Ooh,
Well,
but
but Christianity has those people too, right? There's people who
yeah,
we
yeah,
talked about this a little bit last time that there are
yeah, the
people within
liberals.
Christianity who believe that all of this is metaphorical, and there's even people who claim to be Christians who believe in universalism, that everybody will ultimately be saved, and that
Right.
everything the Bible says about things like hell and God's wrath is really either metaphorical or some kind of anthropomorphizing or whatever, and that none of that is really going to happen. It's all, or there are some people, just to be really fair and steel man, there are some who will say that everything that the Bible says about hell sort of happens, but it's actually more like the Catholic concept of purgatory, and all of these people eventually, even Satan himself, eventually get saved in the
Yeah.
ceaseless eons of time. And I've even had a conversation with one of these people who said, because I mean, come on, after you've been burning for a few thousand years, like you're gonna give up eventually. And I'm like, dude, you're missing the point. But anyway, my
Yeah,
point being
again,
that like we have those
again,
too.
it sort of assumes that it's going to be like a endless linear succession of moments. Like it's been 2,000 years, isn't that enough already? Like probably doesn't work that way.
Yeah, exactly. Like I don't think eternity is
For all we know, they might experience it as like a sort of agonizing eternal now. You know what I mean?
right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And then also, but I guess my point is that, like,
Yeah,
I would address to a certain extent, I think that a Hindu who is doing that respectfully, I think that's the same kind of thing as a Christian who is explaining away parts of Christianity he doesn't
yeah,
like. Like, at some point, we have to I love any Hindus who are here. I love you being here. If you're somebody who doesn't believe certain things out of your own tradition, I'm still glad you're here. However, I do think that to a certain extent, when we address these things, we have to assume that people who are listening actually believe what their religion teaches, whether it's Christianity or Hinduism, and
right.
those who are falling kind of outside of that category. I'm not saying that this discussion isn't for you, but I am saying that like I I think you should really examine in your heart, like, is my religion something that God has revealed, or the gods, I guess, if you're pagan, but is it something that God has revealed and that I am to live in light of, or is it something that I get to determine? Because if it's something I get to determine, then how do I know that it's actually true? If it's something that has been revealed, then it ought to change me. I ought not to change it. And I think that that's um so I guess what I'm saying is if you're a Hindu who doesn't really believe the things that are in Hinduism, then maybe before you can consider becoming a Christian, you should consider becoming like a full-bore Hindu and actually believe your own religion
Yeah.
for a time. But and if you're a Christian who doesn't really believe in Christianity, but you're examining this maybe because you're considering Hinduism, maybe before making that leap, actually try being a Christian for a while and really believing Christian things, and see how that works for you. Anyway,
Yeah.
I don't want to get too far down the weeds on that, but
No
like,
worries.
but I do think it's important that because you made that point, and I think that's a very good point that like, yeah, there are people, and I know Christianity is more dogmatic than Hinduism on this, but even we have these people who really don't
Yeah.
affirm Christian teaching and still want to call themselves Christian. So I get that, but
Right.
at the same time, like maybe that says something about your commitment to your own religion if you're not really willing to adhere to
Yeah.
parts of it that make you uncomfortable. Um, so to
Right.
work
And
through that. Ask
yeah,
yourself why that is.
exactly. And ironically, one of the people that sort of paved the way for me to come back to Christianity is actually a good friend of mine, um, who I'm, God willing, hopefully, uh, once this episode is out, he'll have the time to sit down and listen to it. But he's he's a good friend of mine, and he belongs to the uh, Shaiva tradition, specifically the Tantric Shaiva tradition, and he is as traditional as they come. He is a Brahmana, meaning he belongs to the priestly Varna. Varna is the word that's usually translated to caste, but it doesn't really mean that. Long story, we'll cover it a different time. But he belongs to the priestly Varna. He, from what I understand, he observes a strict vegetarian diet. He,
Just like Vivek.
who's Vivek?
Vivek Ramaswamy is Vivek Ramaswamy is an
Oh, Vivek.
American
Oh, yeah, yeah.
politician
Sorry, sorry. Yeah,
who's a Hindu
the
and
yeah,
I actually really like him to be honest, but yeah, he's a Hindu, so he has no chance of ever being president here in this country because too much of the people who he would need to vote for him would never vote for a Hindu. So,
yeah.
um,
Which is unfortunate because the U.S. is a secular country anyway. Just at that point, just vote for the best guy.
right. Yeah. I
Um,
mean, yeah, whether I like it or not, the US is a secular country and um but, as long as I think there's sort of a mythology about the US that the US is this Christian land and all of this and
I
that
know.
mythology is not really true.
Yeah.
So,
For 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 those who, for those like traditional down home, good old boy type Christians, uh, who think the founding fathers were like devout um, Christians, have a browse, jaunt through the Jefferson Bible.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Or really any of Thomas Jefferson's like read
Yeah.
yeah, you just read Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. Everybody loves John Adams when he says that the US Constitution can only function among a religious people, but they don't like John Adams when he actually expresses his opinion about the Christians who he believes are necessary in order to function under the Constitution. Like he believes that, but he also believes we're really stupid, and that we're totally in a dumb religion. like he hates us. He acknowledges that he needs us in order for his system to function, but he doesn't actually believe that we're necessarily like
Correct.
correct. He thinks that we're idiots. He just thinks that we're useful idiots, to use the communist phrase. Um, so point being that like this is, but
Sorry.
anyway, sorry about that. I just thought it when you said the thing about vegetarianism, I was like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
just like Vivek Ramaswamy,
Right.
because he
But
made a video about being vegetarian or whatever, and it
yeah.
was popular.
Yeah. So my friend, I'm not gonna call him out by name because just in case, like he wants his privacy. So I'm gonna,
Sure,
I don't know what his wishes are when it comes to that. So I'm just gonna uh, leave him nameless. But suffice it to say, he's a brahmana of the Shaiva tradition, which means he's a devotee of Shiva. And when towards the sorry, I'm trying to like angle my phone right.
you're good.
There we go. So towards the end of my time as a Hindu, I was very much like a devout Shaiva, specifically belonging to a tradition called Trika Shaivism, which is a tantric school that um, didn't originate, but sort of reached its full flower in the region of Kashmir.
Mm. Where the sweaters are from?
Oh, that was so American. But so so basically a lot of things that I sort of because when I was a Hindu, for most of the time I was very liberal, you know what I mean?
Right,
Because Hinduism isn't dogmatic and it sort of gives you the liberty to agree, disagree, debate, almost anything is up for debate, right? So I took that to mean if it immediately does, ideally what that means is you really grapple with it, you ask questions, and if after all that uh it still doesn't make sense to you, you can just leave that alone. You don't have to believe it. You know what I mean? But in practice, what it boils down to is this makes me uncomfortable. I don't like this, or I personally don't believe this, so I'm just not going to believe it.
right.
And that's where I was at. And my friend, sort of in our conversations, he really gave me a blessing because he sort of forced me to face that which makes me uncomfortable and confront it and like really decide like why do I disagree with this inherently? Like, why is this a problem? Right. So, so like the idea, so like for example, I didn't agree with the idea of the Varna system, at least in a certain way. Like why does there have to be a sort of priestly class? Why does there have to be these people that at certain times of the year or at certain times of the day like won't even touch people of lower Varnas lest they be
Right.
like contaminated, but like lest they be rendered ritually impure. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it, I'm like, why does it have to be like that? Or the Vedas, right? Like, why can't the study and teaching of the Vedas be available to everybody and this and that, the other thing? And he's like, he's like, what you're saying is we should be handing out college professor jobs to everybody. Like, he's like, what you're saying is the religious equivalent to that.
Right.
That somebody who just sort of read some of the Vedas because they have like a PDF on their phone is the same thing as someone who was brought up in a priestly family from birth, taught by their father the priestly practices, all the mantras they have to chant, memorizing thousands and thousands of pages of worth of stuff, hundreds and hundreds of hours of scripture to in the Vedas to memorize.
Right.
and he's basically saying like he's like saying, sure, we would gladly welcome people in if they were willing to do that, give up, a secular, essentially a secular life, or at least a fully secular life.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are brahmanas who can get a job, they can be a dentist or whatever, but they also have to set aside time for their priestly duties. But essentially, he's saying like, yeah, if they're willing to like give up a good amount of their secular life, if they're willing to commit to a purely vegetarian diet and stay away from like uh, risque films and sexual cinema and never touch pornography and do this and do that. Sure, maybe then we'll take them in, but he's like no, but he says like the vast majority of people don't want to do that, and what you're
Right.
saying is we should open up the priesthood to them anyway.
Right.
And I'm damn, you're right.
Right.
um so the reason why that matters to me is because it sort of brought an end to my like helped bring an end to my rebellious sort of anarchical view of spirituality and taught me to respect hierarchy again.
Based. Based. Oh,
So
that's
that when I
awesome.
did
I
come
love
back
hearing
into
that.
Christianity, um, when I did run into like low church Protestants, they're like, why can't everybody be like an elder, like a priest or whatever you call it? I'm like, because.
Right, exactly. Same argument.
Yeah. And he also taught me other things. Like before I came into Christianity, before I came back into Christianity, he convinced me that homosexual sex is no bueno.
Good.
and and Hinduism doesn't, aside from okay, um, it's a little complicated because since there aside from the main Vedas, since there isn't like a universal body of texts other than
Right.
like the Vedas, which are the foundation, there isn't definitive, sort of universal position on homosexuality in Hinduism. But as he pointed out, among at least his sect of Brahmanas, it is prohibited. It is seen as impure sex.
Hmm.
And I'm like, why? And because I was still a bit liberal when it came to those things
Right.
at the time. And he says, because you can't have children.
Yeah.
And he like funny enough, like it wasn't me coming back into Christianity and reading like Christian apologists that convinced me of the teleological sexual ethic. It was my Hindu friend.
Yeah.
He
Right.
basically said like
Because,
he basically said he in our conversations he said if sex isn't first and foremost for the purpose of bearing children, which is what it exists for in nature, which
hmm,
is its primary aim even before pleasure, if that is not at the forefront of what makes the sexual ethic like sex licit and wholesome,
right.
then anything goes, include up to and including necrophilia and bestiality.
Exactly. Yep. He's not wrong. He's not
Yeah.
wrong.
So
He's not wrong. You
yeah.
you start
So
with a really basic understanding of something's form and function and go from there. Like he's not wrong.
yeah, and
And
he
we've
and
seen
he and
that
he
play
convinced
out.
me. He convinced me of it not by citing the Vedas, not by citing this or that scripture, but on purely philosophical, natural law grounds. And so, so so he's what I would call a traditional Hindu. He does granted, there isn't a unified Hindu tradition, but at least with the Vedas as the foundation, and especially if you're belonging to the priestly class, you can't do the whole picking and choosing what makes you comfortable thing.
That's right.
So, so he sort of turned me into a traditional Hindu, which then sort of laid the groundwork for me to then come back as a traditional Christian.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. G.K. Chesterton, a famous Catholic writer, once said, men will have to become pagan again before they can become Christians again in the West. And I I think that to a certain extent, that is because there's lots of reasons why I think that there's wisdom in that statement, but one of them is exactly what you just said. So much of Western Christianity has been, this is this Bible verse, therefore you have to do this. And unfortunately, that's not always convincing. This is why, like I can't remember if it was our last video or the one we did before that, where I said, one of the things I never want to do in talking to Hindus is say, here's what my Bible says. Now you have to live according to it. It has to be an argument that actually recognizes where they're coming from. Otherwise, why bother
Right.
making it?
We have to begin with common ground and build off of that
Exactly.
common ground. So
Exactly.
so yeah, that was so I realized that certain things exist for a reason, that before you sort of discard something, at least try to understand what you're discarding.
Exactly. Do not move the ancient landmark without first understanding why it has been established, as our scriptures say.
Yeah. So all the so and so all this to say, sorry, I veered off of course a
No,
little
you're
bit,
okay. You're not really veering off
but it's
course
still,
that
it
much.
still
Like,
fits into into the topic, because it still fits my point, which is to say that at least when we take traditional Hinduism into account, there's a lot more in common between the two of us than either Christians or Hindus are willing to admit.
right, exactly.
Um, and yeah, so like if you belong to a traditional uh, Brahmana class, you have to adhere to certain standards that other regular people don't
Mm-hmm.
have to. Um, you have to hold yourself up to a higher degree of morality. You have to hold yourself up to a higher standard of ritual purity. There are things that you can't eat that other people can. There are things that you can wear that you can't wear that other people can. Um, so and part of that is you sort of understand and learn those parts of scripture that a lot of normal people just pick and choose,
Right,
which includes, Kali uh, decapitating demons and drinking their blood.
right.
um,
Yeah, so you have to wrestle with aspects just like, you know, we w just like sometimes we have to wrestle with aspects of things that, you know, and I think that that makes people like I think that makes you a better person, to be honest. Having to be a little bit uncomfortable with some of the things that you know, um, I I don't know if you know this, Sarkis, but actually, you do know this now that I think about it. But in my day job, when I'm not making YouTube videos, is I'm a biblical counselor, and
mm,
one of the things that I recently came up against is in one of my sessions, I won't say any names or what was going on, but in one of my sessions, I had to give someone counsel that ran very counter to what my heart was saying. In my heart, I wanted to tell this person to leave their spouse. I wanted to tell them, your spouse is a jerk. They're not treating you properly. They're not you're I can literally see that you're miserable, and that this person is making you miserable, because you used to be this bubbly, happy person walking around singing, and now you look like you're carrying a weight around with you. You're just miserable. And I wanted to say, just leave, just get out. But I knew that biblically, what I had to tell them was, You know, God gives us the power to endure. Now, with that said, I want to be really careful because I know that somebody right now listening might actually be like in literal danger and hearing what I'm saying and be like, I need to stay and suffer this for God. Not necessarily. There are times, this is why we don't rely on private interpretation, right? There are times call your pastor or
Mhm.
priest. You may need to separate yourself for a season. That's not the same as getting a divorce. Separating yourself for a season so that you can have, a better quality of life and so that you can have restoration. The Bible also talks about giving people up to Satan. So, we have to be careful how we apply certain things. But my point is just that
Yeah,
in this specific case, what this person needed for their own benefit and for their own good was something that I was very uncomfortable telling them. But afterwards, they thanked me. And the reason is because part of what I believe to be true in Christianity and it sounds like it's true in Hinduism as well, part of what makes us better people is having to wrestle with we don't get to take the easy way out. We don't get to just say, I don't like this, so I'm not going to do it, or I don't like this, so I'm not going to believe it. We become
yeah,
better people by recognizing I don't have all the answers. Just because this makes me uncomfortable doesn't mean it's wrong, and going from there. So,
yeah.
you know,
The Bhagavad Gita itself, and from a Hindu perspective, the Bhagavad Gita itself is a masterclass in that.
yeah,
Like, it's like you have the character of Arjuna, who's like sort of our everyman,
yeah,
comfortable doing this. Like, can I just devote myself to God in a monastic life? Can I just give up the world and retreat into the forest and live as a hermit and this and that, the other
right.
thing? And then God Himself says, no, that's not what I want you to do.
Exactly.
Like like
Exactly.
like He's almost saying like you think you know how to serve me more than me.
Right. Right, exactly, because God raises up kings and God. By the way, I have to say, as a Christian, I actually really enjoy the Bhagavad Gita. I haven't gotten around to I forgot how it's pronounced, but the what is it again, Satkis?
Oh,
Marhab
Mahabharata.
Mahabharata. I haven't gotten around to the whole thing, but I did read the Bhagavad Gita. I actually have it on audiobook and I read it because I don't you probably know the story of Sundar Singh. I had read the account of his life, and one of the things that it talked about was the fact that he had actually memorized the Bhagavad Gita and
Mm.
that he loved it so much, but ultimately it actually led him to Christianity. We don't have time to get into why that was, but it did. It led him into Christianity actually. But he memorized the Bhagavad Gita when he was a child, and hearing that, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And so I listened to the Bhagavad Gita on audiobook, and I loved it. It's a very um it's sort of like Lord of the Rings. It's a very compelling story, or like you said, the Odyssey and the Iliad. Very compelling story, very interesting, philosophically rich. Obviously, there's things I disagree with as a Christian, but I
Right.
read books all the time by people I disagree with. So,
Yeah.
really awesome book to read. I highly recommend it to anybody who is interested in learning more about Hinduism, either as a Christian to answer Hinduism, or even if you are Hindu, like I was
Yeah.
saying before, actually read these things that are part of your tradition. And
It,
I truly believe that that is the best way for someone to come into Christianity. You're not gonna I don't really think, if I'm honest, I don't really think most people who convert to Christianity from Hinduism are going to convert from like a liberal kind of vapid, I just do what I want Hinduism. I think the
Right,
people
right.
who are going to become Christian are the people who actually take their religion seriously enough to then take, because otherwise they're not going to take Christianity seriously either. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Well, that, yeah, being so, yeah, A, I would say more traditional Hindus, and B, I was like, thanks. Okay. And B, people who sort of have seen the fruits of the lackadaisical thinking of our modern society
Right.
and seen how rotten those fruits are, right?
Hmm.
Because for me, I I never I never was interested, like deep down inside, I was never drawn to, at least not for very long, drawn to like the idea of casual sex,
Right.
like swinging, going out clubs, sleeping with women, whatever.
Right.
But so I'm like, I would always be looking at it from this perspective of like, what happened, like living in California, right? I'd be like, what happened to love, man? Like, what happened to like what happened to when men and women actually loved each other? Now it's all just, screwing and like hooking up and this and all that.
Right.
But at the same time, I'm like I still had like a more liberal view when it came to like sex and marriage, in that, like, okay, I'm okay, like I think it's like I thought it was okay for a couple to have sex as long as they were in a loving relationship, even if they weren't married.
Right.
like um but then I'm like, okay, at, as I sort of came to, you know little by little back into a more traditionalist mindset, I'm like, well, if they're in such a loving relationship, why don't they just seal the deal? What's
Yeah, exactly.
like like okay, you can't wait for like 6 months, like you can't propose, wait, hold, um hold your seat in for like 6 months and then wait until your wedding night. You know what I
Right.
mean? So it's that whole separation of, it took my traditional Hindu friend to show me that it's that separation of sex from the reproductive act that resulted in the sort of loose sexual degeneracy that I
That's
hated so
right.
much.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Um, yeah, to him, I'm always going to be eternally grateful.
For
um,
sure. For sure. Hey, I have to get going pretty soon here,
uh,
but did you have any kind of final closing thoughts that you wanted to share for our Hindu friends, for our Christian friends, etc.?
yeah, I would say, okay. Well, first of all, I gotta apologize because we went off on so many tangents. We didn't get to the Calvinist part of the episode.
We did not. We did not. My
So
whole
I guess we're
spiel
gonna.
at the beginning is meaningless now. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, you know what? It doesn't have to be, because we can have a part two.
Yes. Yes. Part two will be Calvinism.
Yeah. So consider this episode laying the groundwork for the next part. Um, but I guess to leave off on a good message, I'll say, whether you're Hindu or Christian, before you dismiss an aspect of the faith, think about it long and hard.
Hmm.
Consider the possibility that certain things are there for a reason. That, you know, before you sort of demolish that ugly pillar at the center of the room, that is an eyesore, consider the possibility that that pillar that you find ugly might be holding up the roof.
Exactly. Ooh, that's good. I love that. So there you have it, folks. That's our discussion on divine wrath. And, just to kind of give like a little summary, I would just say that, like Sarkis said, ultimately, maybe this episode, if you're a Hindu, maybe this episode doesn't convince you, like, okay, now I'll come become a Christian. But I hope it at least convinces you that divine wrath isn't really a good reason to stay away because your own tradition has this concept in it. And I hope that if nothing else, if we haven't brought you to Christianity, then I hope we've at least made you a better Hindu because, like Sarkis said, that pillar that you don't like might be holding the roof up. And we have those pillars, and you have those pillars, and in this particular case, what I think is really cool is that this doesn't have to be an objection for either side of this debate. This is actually an area where we're in unity. Hindus and Christians both believe in the divine wrath. We both believe that wrath is an aspect of how God interacts with the world. And
Right.
so that's not something actually that like I don't have to try to make a list of verses from the Vedas that oh, this is violent, so therefore your God is bad, and you don't have to do that from our Bible. We can both actually
Right.
just look at one another and say, "Hey, this is something we have in common," and then let's build from there. Like Sarkis said earlier, and like I alluded to earlier, everything doesn't have to be disagreeing and hating each other's tradition. We can actually recognize points of contact, points of agreement, and build from there. And I think it's beautiful when we're able to do that. So, thank you
Yeah.
very much for watching, everybody. And please do share this with your friends, especially your Hindu friends or, Christian friends who object to the idea of divine wrath. Send this to them too, and God bless.
God bless.